The rain had been falling since before midnight. The kind of slow, indifferent drizzle that made the streets of Caldwell, Georgia, looked like a painting left out too long in the weather. It was just past 2 in the morning when the black SUV pulled over to the curb on Meridian Avenue. Hazard lights blinking. The driver stepping out to crouch beside a rear tire that had gone flat somewhere between the highway and the hotel. Major General Raymond Elias Whitfield didn't curse. He didn't slam the door. He simply stood in the rain in his civilian clothes, charcoal slacks, a dark green quarter zip, running shoes, and assessed the situation the same way he'd assessed every situation in 31 years of military service, calmly. Methodically, without panic. He'd just flown in from Fort Bragg, a red-eye connection through Atlanta that had landed 40 minutes late. His aide had offered to drive him. He'd declined. He always drove himself when he could. It was one of the few spaces left in his life where he was just a man with a destination and a steering wheel. No rank. No ceremony. No weight of command pressing down on his shoulders. He was reaching into the cargo area for the jack when the first patrol car pulled up. Officer Dale Merritt was 26 years old and had been on the Caldwell PD for 14 months. He was not a bad person. That matters, because the worst things in the world are rarely done by bad people. They're done by ordinary people operating inside systems that have never asked them to look closely at their own assumptions. He saw a black man in dark clothing crouched beside a vehicle in a neighborhood where, according to dispatch logs, he'd internalized over 14 months. Suspicious activity calls came in with a particular kind of frequency. He did not see a man changing a tire. He saw a pattern he'd been trained to respond to. He turned on the spotlight. Sir, step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them. Raymond Whitfield straightened slowly. He'd been in the army since he was 18 years old. He'd served in 3 combat theaters, commanded battalions, brigades, a division. He'd sat across negotiating tables from foreign officials who wanted him dead. He knew how to be still under pressure. He raised his hands. Officer, he said, his voice even, unhurried. I have a flat tire. I'm changing it. My registration and ID are in the glove compartment. A second patrol car had arrived by then. Officer Kendra Voss, 31, 4 years on the force, stepped out with her hand resting on her belt. Neither officer moved to help him. Neither officer asked to see identification from where they stood. Instead, Merritt told him to put his hands on the hood of the vehicle. And they patted him down on a public street in the rain, in front of 2 passing cars, whose drivers slowed to watch. It was Voss who found the tactical folding knife clipped inside his jacket pocket. What's this? She said, holding it up in the spotlight. A personal utility tool. Whitfield said, legal to carry in this state. Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us while we verify that. He looked at her. He looked at the flat tire. He looked at the rain. Am I being detained? We're bringing you in for questioning regarding a suspicious vehicle report in this area. There had been no such report. He would learn that later. But in the moment, Raymond Whitfield did what he had always done. In the face of unjust authority, he complied. Quietly and completely. Storing every detail in the same methodical mind that had once coordinated logistics for 18,000 soldiers across 2 time zones. They put him in the back of Merritt's patrol car. They left his SUV on the curb with the hazard still blinking. The Caldwell Police Department's 3rd District Station was a low brick building that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial floor cleaner. At 2:30 in the morning, the overnight skeleton crew was half asleep. The fluorescent lights doing their cold, indifferent work above a room of beige cubicles and whiteboards covered in case numbers. Sergeant Thomas Breck, the overnight watch commander, barely looked up when they brought Whitfield in. What you got? Suspicious activity on Meridian, Merritt said. Found a blade on him. Breck finally looked at the man standing in front of his desk. He saw a black man in his mid-50s, still broad-shouldered, still straight-spined. still dry-eyed despite the indignity of the last 30 minutes. Something about the way he held himself made Breck pause for just a second. Then the pause passed. Process him. Hold room 2. Whitfield was fingerprinted. He was photographed. He was walked to a holding room with a metal bench and a drain in the floor and left there with the door locked. He sat down. He folded his hands on his knees. And he waited. He did not demand a phone call. He did not raise his voice. He asked, once, calmly, whether he might be permitted to contact someone. He was told he could make a call in the morning. It was not yet 3 a.m., so he waited. He'd waited in worse places. He'd waited in a field hospital in Afghanistan, while a soldier under his command was worked on by medics who weren't sure they could save him. He'd waited in a conference room in the Pentagon for a meeting with a Secretary of Defense who'd ultimately decided his proposal was too politically complicated to pursue. He'd waited. At 19 years old, outside a courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, while his father was questioned for a traffic stop that had somehow lasted 6 hours. Waiting was something Raymond Whitfield understood completely. It was, he had long since concluded, one of the primary languages of power who was made to wait. And who made others wait. He counted the tiles on the floor. There were 47, back at the front desk. Merritt was finishing his incident report when he noticed something odd. The ID they'd logged, the one taken from Whitfield's wallet during processing, wasn't a Georgia driver's license. It was a Department of Defense identification card, the kind with a specific color-coded strip and a rank designation printed in small b. Precise lettering. He picked it up and squinted at it under the fluorescent light. The rank listed was 08. Merritt had been in JROTC for 2 years in high school. He knew enough to know that 08 was not a common designation. He typed it into the search bar of the open browser on the desk computer. Just to be sure. Ovwi, Major General. Två-star rank. U.S. Army. He sat with that for a moment. Then he walked it over to Sergeant Breck. Breck looked at it. He turned it over. He looked at the photograph on the card, the same man currently sitting in hold room 2, and at the name printed beneath it in block letters. Whitfield. He said aloud. Almost to himself. He had heard that name before, though he couldn't immediately place where. He set the ID down on the desk and pulled up a different browser window. He typed the name in. The results came back immediately. A photo from a Department of Defense press release, Raymond Elias Whitfield, in full dress uniform. Chest covered in ribbons. 2 silver stars on each shoulder. Shaking hands with the Secretary of the Army at a commendation ceremony 6 months prior. Breck stared at the screen for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "Go get Voss." There are moments in institutional life when the machinery of a system grinds to a halt. Not because someone ordered it to, but because someone finally looked at what the machinery was doing and felt something cold move through them. This was one of those moments. Voss came out of the break room with a coffee mug in her hand and stopped when she saw Breck's face. What? He turned the monitor toward her. She set the mug down slowly. He told us he had a flat tire. She said, yes, he did. We left his car on Meridian. Yes, we did. The silence stretched between them, somewhere in the building. A phone rang twice and stopped. Who do we call? Voss said. Breck rubbed his face. I need to make some calls. Don't say anything to anyone else yet. He found the number he needed through 3 separate channels, the DoD Public Affairs Directory, a contact at Fort Bragg's Public Affairs Office who didn't pick up, and finally a direct line he was given by an on-call duty officer who, once Breck explained the situation, went very quiet and then said he needed to transfer the call. It was 3:20 in the morning. The voice that came on the line was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was the voice of a man who was accustomed to being the calmest person in any room, even especially at 3 in the morning. This is General Marcus Webb, Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. Who am I speaking with? Breck told him. Sergeant Breck. Webb said, I'm going to need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. What General Webb said in the next 4 minutes would be described later by Breck himself as the most precise and unhurried dressing down he had ever received, and he had received several. In the army himself, before his discharge and subsequent career in law enforcement, Webb did not yell. He did not threaten. He stated facts, one after another, in a tone that made each one land like a closed fist on a desk. The man in Hold Room 2 had commanded more personnel than the entire Caldwell Metropolitan Police Force combined. He had been awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, with 2 oak leaf clusters, and the Bronze Star with Valor. He was currently assigned to the Joint Chiefs Advisory Panel. He had, 3 weeks prior, given a briefing to the National Security Council, and he had been detained in the rain while changing a tire, had his property searched without cause, and had been placed in a holding cell at 2:30 in the morning. I will be making a call to your Chief of Police in approximately 6 minutes. Webb said, I strongly suggest you use those 6 minutes wisely. The line went dead. Sergeant Thomas Breck walked to Hold Room 2. He had been a police officer for 11 years. He had once chased a suspect across 4 city blocks in August heat and caught him. He had talked a man off a bridge overpass on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He had delivered a death notification to a mother and watched her knees give out in the doorway. None of those things had made him feel the way he felt walking down that corridor. He unlocked the door. Raymond Whitfield was sitting exactly where they had left him, hands folded on his knees, back straight, expression unchanged. He looked up when the door opened, and Breck saw, for the first time, the full weight of the man's self-possession, the particular stillness of someone who has never needed the room to agree with him in order to know who he is. General Whitfield. Breck said. The words felt strange in his mouth. Sir, I owe you an apology. Whitfield looked at him. We've contacted someone at the Pentagon. Your vehicle will be my tire. Whitfield said, Sir, my tire still needs to be changed. Breck blinked. We'll have someone take care of that. Sir. Good. Whitfield stood, unhurried, and straightened his quarter zip. Then let's proceed. What happened in the next 40 minutes at the Caldwell 3rd District Station was something none of the officers present would fully articulate in the days that followed. Though all of them would remember it, the Chief of Police, Daniel Okafor himself, a former MP. 22 years on, the job arrived at the station at 4:05 in the morning, in a car he'd driven himself, still in civilian clothes, moving with the particular urgency of a man who has been told something he cannot unhear. He went directly to Hold Room 2. But Whitfield had already been brought to the sergeant's office. Okafor stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the man sitting across the desk. General, he said. Chief, said Whitfield, I want to apologize personally and without qualification for what happened to you tonight. Whitfield nodded once. He didn't accept the apology effusively. He didn't make it easy. He let it sit in the air. My officers, Okafor began, were operating on assumptions that your department has allowed to calcify for a long time. Whitfield said, not unkindly. Precisely. That's a structural problem. Chief. Not an individual one. Though individuals carry it forward. Okafor sat down. They spoke for 31 minutes. Later, Okafor would describe it as the most instructive conversation of his professional life. In the front room of the station, something else was happening. Word had moved through the building in the way that all significant information moves through closed institutional spaces fast. Quiet, slightly distorted, but fundamentally accurate. Every officer on the overnight shift knew. The 2 who'd come in early for the morning rotation knew. Even the administrative aide who processed overnight paperwork knew. Merritt sat at his desk and stared at the incident report he'd filed. He read it back to himself. He read it the way he imagined someone else would read it, someone who knew what he now knew about the man in the holding room. Every sentence looked different from that angle. He flagged the report. He wrote, in the notes field, a single line, requesting supervisory review prior to formal submission. Then he sat back and didn't know what to do with his hands. At 5:17 in the morning, General Raymond Whitfield walked out of the Caldwell 3rd District Station. He was not escorted with fanfare. There were no cameras, no press release, no performative gestures of rehabilitation. That was not what this was. He walked out the front door and into a morning that had stopped raining. The sky going from black to the particular shade of dark blue that precedes dawn by exactly 40 minutes. His SUV was parked at the curb outside the station. Someone had changed the tire. The hazard lights were off. He stood beside it for a moment. Chief Okafor had walked him out. Sergeant Breck was behind them. Merritt and Voss stood just inside the glass door. Not quite crossing the threshold into the morning air, Okafor extended his hand. General. Again, I am sorry. Whitfield shook it. I know you are. He got in the SUV. He checked the mirrors. He pulled out onto the empty street and drove toward his hotel without turning on the radio. The formal inquiry began 6 days later. It was not initiated by General Whitfield. He had not filed a complaint, had not spoken to the press, had not contacted a lawyer. He checked into his hotel at 5:45 in the morning, slept for 4 hours, attended the conference for which he'd flown to Caldwell in the first place, and returned to Fort Bragg on a Tuesday afternoon flight. The inquiry was initiated by the Pentagon, specifically by General Webb's office, which had logged the call with Breck and subsequently flagged the incident through proper channels to the Army Inspector General, who had flagged it to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, who had reached out to the Georgia Attorney General's office. By the time the first formal notification arrived at the Caldwell PD, the incident had already been reviewed by 4 separate offices, none of which were disposed toward leniency. The internal affairs investigation that followed would examine not just the conduct of officers Merritt and Voss, but the broader statistical patterns of stops, detentions, and use of force incidents in the 3rd District over the prior 36 months. What those numbers revealed, documented in a report that would eventually become public, was not, in the end, surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. But numbers in a report are one thing. A 2-star general sitting in a holding room with 47 tiles on the floor is another. The former can be disputed. The latter has a face. Merritt was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. He was not fired immediately. The union filed the standard protective paperwork. His union rep told him the process would take time and to stay off social media. He stayed off social media. He spent a lot of time at home thinking about the incident report he'd filed, about the 14 months of patrol, about the stops he'd made that hadn't produced any calls from the Pentagon because the people involved weren't 2-star generals. He thought about that for a long time. He asked, eventually, through proper channels, whether it was possible to meet with General Whitfield. The request was unusual enough that it moved up several levels before someone made a quiet inquiry. The answer that came back was brief. The general has no objection, but it is not something he is pursuing. Merritt understood. Some things aren't owed to the person who caused the harm. Voss, for her part, returned to duty after a 2-week suspension without pay and requested a transfer to community outreach, a unit she'd been quietly interested in for 2 years but hadn't acted on. Her new supervisor described her, in the months that followed, as one of the most attentive officers he'd worked with. Whether that was the result of that night or simply who she'd always been, given the space to be it, no one could say for certain. Sergeant Breck retired at the end of the year, 2 years earlier than he'd planned. He didn't give a big reason. He told his wife he was tired, and she believed him. The story became public in the way most things do, not all at once, but in pieces, through channels that were not controlled by anyone who'd been in that building. A DOD source, a civil rights attorney who'd seen the IG filing, a local Caldwell journalist who'd been covering the 3rd District's stop patterns for 18 months and suddenly found her readership expanding beyond the county line. The coverage was significant. It ran for several weeks. There were op-eds. There were panel discussions. There was, briefly, a cable news segment that got the timeline slightly wrong and had to issue a correction. General Whitfield gave one interview. It was to a print journalist, conducted via email, and he took 3 days to compose his answers. He did not describe the incident in dramatic terms. He described it in the same flat, precise register he used for everything. I was treated the way a great many men who look like me have been treated in similar circumstances, with considerably less recourse. He wrote, "The difference in my case was not in what happened to me but in who I am on paper. That difference is the problem, not the solution." It was the most widely circulated thing he'd ever said publicly. And he'd given testimony before Congress twice. The conference in Caldwell, the event he'd flown in to attend, was a 2-day symposium on military and civilian law enforcement cooperation, organized by a think tank that specialized in public safety policy. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew why Whitfield had been in town. He gave his keynote address on the afternoon of the first day. Approximately 8 hours after being released from the holding room, he'd slept 4 hours and changed into his dress uniform. The audience was primarily law enforcement administrators, policy researchers, and a handful of active duty officers. He delivered the address he'd prepared without alteration or addition. He did not mention what had happened the night before. He did not look out at the audience with accusation. He talked about trust. He talked about the long, unfinished project of building institutions that were worthy of the communities they were supposed to serve. He talked about the gap between stated values and operational reality, a gap he called the distance between the flag and the floor. Several people in the room had heard about the arrest by then. Word travels in those circles. They sat and listened to him talk about institutional accountability and felt the specific discomfort of people who are confronted with a living illustration of their own subject matter. He received a standing ovation. He thanked the room and left the stage. And he did not look like a man who'd spent an hour and a half in a holding cell the night before, which was, in its own way, the most powerful thing he could have done. There is a version of this story that ends with punishment and public accountability, and a clean moral ledger where the officers lose their jobs, and the department is reformed, and everyone learns something and moves forward into a better future. That version exists, in pieces, scattered across the investigation reports and the policy memos, and the revised training protocols that the Caldwell PD began implementing 8 months after the incident. It exists in the Community Oversight Board that was quietly expanded and given actual authority over stop and detain procedures. It exists in the mandatory implicit bias training that every officer, incoming and current, was required to complete. These are real things. They matter, but they are not the same as the version of the story where none of it needed to happen in the first place. Raymond Whitfield knew that. He'd known it since he was 19 years old. Watching his father wait 6 hours in a courthouse in Birmingham for a question about a traffic stop that was never really about the traffic stop. He kept a photograph on his desk at Fort Bragg, not a military portrait, not a commendation ceremony, just a snapshot of his father standing outside that courthouse in the late afternoon, squinting into the sun, hands in the pockets of his good slacks, looking like a man who has decided that the day is not going to beat him. Whitfield had that same look. It had taken him years to understand where it came from. On the morning of his return flight, sitting in the Caldwell Regional Airport with a coffee he hadn't finished and a briefcase full of policy documents, he thought about his father. He thought about 47 floor tiles. He thought about the particular quality of the dark blue sky at 5 in the morning. Just before the sun commits to rising, he thought about the standing ovation and the thing it contained that was not quite admiration, something more complicated, more uncomfortable. The sound of a room reckoning with itself. He didn't know precisely what would come of any of it. He'd been in institutions long enough to know that change was less like a door opening and more like ice melting slow. Incremental. invisible until suddenly it wasn't. You rarely got to see the moment. You just kept doing the work and trusted that the temperature was changing. He finished the coffee. He picked up his briefcase. He walked to his gate and stood in line like everyone else. He was a man with a ticket and a destination. He was also something else. He always had been. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass and said, "Have a great flight." And he said, "Thank you," and meant it, and walked down the jetway into the morning.